Some women are born knowing they are meant for more. They feel it in their bones before the world ever gives them a reason to believe it. Like a quiet hum underneath everything ordinary. A persistent whisper that says this is not it. This is not the life. There is something bigger waiting and it has your name on it. Madison Hargrove was one of those women. And in the summer of her 26th year, in a small town outside Macon, Georgia, she decided that feeling was finally worth acting on. But here is what nobody told Madison Hargrove. The city does not care how beautiful you are. The city does not care where you came from or how long you waited or how certain you were that your time had arrived. The city has its own rules. And the woman who drove her to Atlanta in a black Mercedes that smelled like expensive perfume and quiet power knew every single one of those rules. Madison did not. This is the story of what happens when a girl mistakes hunger for strategy and confidence for preparation. This is the story of two women from the same small town who took the same road to Atlanta and arrived at completely different destinations. And this is the story of what was lost that can never be given back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It was a Tuesday morning in late July when Madison Hargrove stood in the doorway of her mother's kitchen and looked around at everything that made up her life and decided she was done with all of it. Done with the cracked linoleum floor that her mother had been meaning to replace for 6 years. Done with the window unit air conditioner that dripped water onto the sill every afternoon and made a sound like a man clearing his throat in his sleep. Done with the smell of grease and dish soap and everything ordinary that clung to the walls of that house like a second layer of paint that no amount of opening windows could clear out. She was 26 years old. She was 5'7" with skin the color of warm honey and cheekbones that women paid surgeons to recreate. She had full lips and a natural grace in the way she moved through a room that made people turn and look twice without always knowing why they had turned. She had been told her entire life that she was the most beautiful girl in Bibb County, and she believed every word of it with a conviction that left no room for doubt or modification, or the kind of quiet humility that might have served her better in what was coming. Her mother, Brenda Hargrove, was at the stove that morning stirring a pot of grits and humming something low and slow the way she always did when she was worried about something she could not find the right words for. Brenda was 52 years old with a face that told the whole story of her life if you knew how to read it. The deep laugh lines around her eyes from years of finding joy in small things. The tension in her jaw from years of holding worry inside because there was nobody to hand it to. The particular set of her shoulders that said, I have carried more than my share, and I will carry more still because that is what mothers do. Madison dropped her phone on the kitchen table and pulled out a chair. She did not sit in it. She just stood behind it with her hands resting on the back and looked at her mother like she was trying to find the right words for something that had been building inside her for years and had finally reached a pressure that demanded release. Mama, she said, I need to talk to you about something. Brenda did not turn around. She just stirred the grits a little slower and said, Go on then. I am leaving, Madison said. Before this year is over, I am leaving this town, and I am not coming back to stay. Brenda was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of response but the gathering of it. Then she turned around and looked at her daughter the way mothers look at children they have been waiting to have this exact conversation with for a very long time. With a knowledge that is tired and loving and not at all surprised. And where are you going, she asked. Atlanta, Madison said. Like the answer was the most obvious thing in the world. Like it was the only answer there had ever been. Brenda put the spoon down on the counter and wiped her hands on her apron and sat down at the table across from the chair her daughter was still standing behind. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She just sat down and folded her hands and said, Tell me what brought this on. And Madison told her. She told her about scrolling through Instagram the night before and seeing Crystal Lawson. Crystal Lawson, who had graduated 2 years ahead of Madison from the same county high school outside Macon. Crystal Lawson, who had not been considered beautiful or popular or particularly remarkable by anyone who knew her back then. She had been the quiet girl. The forgettable one. The one who sat in the back of classrooms and disappeared into hallways and ate her lunch in the library on the days when the cafeteria felt like too much of a performance to survive. Crystal Lawson, who Madison had made fun of more than once in the hallways of that school because cruelty is easy when you are the beautiful one and the world has been rewarding you for your beauty since before you were old enough to understand what reward and cruelty even meant. She had called Crystal ugly to her face in front of other students. She had told people Crystal smelled. She had spread the story about Crystal's father being a drunk even though she had known that was a private and painful thing and had spread it anyway because she could and because at 16 years old she had not yet learned that the things you do to people who cannot fight back have a way of finding you again when you least expect it. Crystal Lawson was now in Atlanta. Crystal Lawson was now posting pictures from rooftop parties in Midtown and charity galas in Buckhead and weekend trips to Miami with men who wore watches that cost more than the house Madison grew up in. Crystal Lawson had a face that barely resembled the girl from school. The roundness was gone. The features were sharper and more defined in the way that suggested careful and expensive intervention. She had a body that looked sculpted with a precision that nature rarely produces on its own. She had a wardrobe that looked like it had been assembled by a professional stylist and a life that looked like a magazine spread that someone had made real just to prove it could be done. And she had 80,000 followers. Mama Madison said, "That girl used to borrow lunch money from me. I used to feel sorry for her. She had nothing. She was nothing that anyone paid attention to. And now she is living a life I was supposed to have before she was. She is living the life I was born for, and she got there first, and I am still standing in this kitchen in Macon, Georgia, watching grits cook on a Tuesday morning." Brenda looked at her daughter for a long time without speaking. She looked at her the way you look at something beautiful that you can see is standing too close to an edge to tell it to step back without it hearing the warning as a challenge. Then she said something that Madison would not fully understand until much later. Much later and much farther from home. She said beauty without wisdom is a door left open in a dangerous neighborhood. You might enjoy the breeze that comes through it, baby, but you will not enjoy what eventually walks in. Madison pushed back from the chair. She said she appreciated the wisdom, but she had made up her mind. She had already sent Crystal a message on Instagram the night before. She had kept it humble and direct. She had said that she was sorry for how she had treated her in school. She had said that she was mature enough now to admit she had been wrong, and that she hoped Crystal had been able to move past the things that had been done to her, and that there were no hard feelings between them. She had not expected Crystal to respond so quickly. She had assumed she might be ignored. She had prepared herself for silence. But Crystal had responded within the hour. She had said she forgave her. She had said that those days were long behind both of them, and that she had learned not to carry things that were too heavy to be worth the effort of holding. And then she had said something that changed everything and set in motion every event that followed. She had said, "Come visit sometime. Atlanta has room for women like you." Brenda listened to all of this, and when Madison finished she was quiet again for a long moment. Then she said one more thing before she stood back up and returned to her grits. She said every girl who has ever left this town chasing something that sparkled did not all find light when they got there. Some of them found fire. And fire, Madison, does not care one bit how beautiful you are before it burns you. Madison heard it. She just did not believe it applied to her. The morning after she sent it, Madison walked over to Destiny Porter's house 2 streets away to say goodbye properly before Crystal arrived. Destiny had been her best friend since the 2nd grade. They had grown up eating peanut butter sandwiches on Brenda's back steps and walking to school together and sharing every secret that mattered and some that did not. If there was one person in Macon, Georgia, who knew Madison Hargrove completely, and without the performance Madison put on for everyone else, it was Destiny. Madison sat down on Destiny's front porch and told her everything. About Crystal's Instagram. About the message she had sent. About Crystal's response and what was happening that afternoon. Destiny listened to all of it carefully. Then she said something that should have landed heavier than it did in that moment. She said, "Madison, I have to ask you something, and I need the honest answer, not the polished one. That apology you sent to Crystal. Did you mean it? Were you genuinely sorry for what you did to that girl in school?" Madison was quiet for just a moment too long. Then she said, "I meant enough of it." Destiny said, "What does that mean exactly?" And Madison said, "It means that I needed a reason to reach out, and the apology gave me one." It means that Crystal has something I want access to, and being humble enough to say sorry first costs me nothing and opens a door that would otherwise stay closed. It means I am strategic Destiny. Not malicious. Strategic. Destiny looked at her for a long moment with the expression she always got when Madison said something that troubled her deeply, but that she knew arguing with directly would only make Madison dig in harder. She said, "You do know that what you just described is using a person's genuine pain as a tool to get what you want." Madison said, "I do not see it that way." Destiny said, "You also do not see that Crystal Lawson might be strategic herself. You are so busy planning your moves that you cannot see that you might be walking into someone else's game." Madison stood up and hugged her. She said she would call when she got there and that Destiny worried too much and that everything was going to be fine. Destiny held onto the hug a second longer than usual. Then she let go and watched Madison walk down the street and said quietly to herself something that Madison did not hear. She said, "Lord, please let that girl come back home whole." What Madison did not know as she walked away was that her honest answer on that porch had revealed something true about herself that would matter before everything was over. She was not the innocent lamb walking into the wolf's den. She had her own teeth. She had her own agenda. She had walked into Crystal's world with a calculated move of her own. The difference between them was not that one was cunning and one was not. The difference was that Crystal had 4 years of experience and a fully constructed system, and Madison had nothing but confidence and a strategic apology and the absolute untested belief that her beauty would compensate for everything she did not yet know. It would not be enough. But she did not know that yet. Crystal Lawson pulled into the driveway of Brenda Hargrove's house on a Friday afternoon in August, and the entire street noticed. The G-Wagon was obsidian black with tinted windows and chrome details that caught the Georgia sun like something engineered specifically to announce itself. It moved down the street with the quiet authority of something that did not need to make noise to be heard. Neighbors stepped out onto porches. A woman 3 houses down stopped watering her garden and just stood there watching with the hose running water onto her own feet without noticing. Crystal stepped out wearing a burnt orange silk jumpsuit and oversized sunglasses and nude heels that somehow did not sink into the gravel of the driveway, as though the laws of physics had made a special accommodation for her. She moved with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to make every entrance look effortless through years of deliberate rehearsal, until the rehearsal disappeared entirely and only the ease remained. Madison watched from the front window with her bags already packed and waiting by the door, and her heart hammering in her chest with something between excitement and the particular electric feeling that comes from standing at the edge of a decision that cannot be undone once made. She had checked and rechecked those bags 3 times that morning. She had been awake since 4. Brenda stood at the door with her arms crossed over her chest. She had been crying earlier that morning, though she would not admit it to her daughter or to anyone else. She had wiped her face clean and put on her practical expression and told herself what she always told herself when there was nothing left to do but accept a thing. That Madison was grown. That grown children make their own choices and carry their own consequences. That the most a mother can do once the choice is made is make sure the door is always open for the return. Crystal walked up the front path with a smile that was warm and polished and gave absolutely nothing away. She greeted Brenda with a hug that was confident and brief, and said, "You must be so proud of how Madison turned out, Mrs. Hargrove. She is just stunning." And Brenda said thank you quietly and looked at Crystal over her shoulder during the hug the way women of a certain age look at people they are trying to see past the surface of. Looking for the thing underneath the presentation. Looking for the temperature of what was actually there. What Brenda saw in Crystal Lawson's eyes when she pulled back from that hug made her chest tighten in a way she could not have put precise words to. It was not malice exactly. It was not the obvious thing you could point to and name. It was something more subtle and in some ways more troubling than obvious malice. It was the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned to operate from behind a performance so thoroughly that the performance had become their primary language. Eyes that observed everything and revealed nothing. Eyes that were working even when the rest of the face was resting in a smile. Those were not the eyes of someone doing a favor. But Madison had her bags by the door and her mind made up and her whole future assembled in her imagination, and there was nothing left for Brenda to do but hold her daughter at the door longer than usual. Longer than Madison expected. Long enough that Madison started to pull back and Brenda held on for just another moment. She pressed her lips to her daughter's temple and whispered into her hair, "Come back to me whole, baby. Whatever happens out there and wherever that city takes you, just come back to me whole. You hear me? That is the only thing I am asking of you. Come back whole." Madison squeezed her mother's hand and picked up her bags and walked down the front path toward the black car, and did not look back because she knew that if she looked back at her mother standing in that doorway, she might not be able to keep walking. She kept walking. In the car, Madison could not stop talking, but underneath the talking something sharper was running. She talked about everything she wanted to do and see and become. She talked about building a presence on social media and attending the right events and meeting the kind of people who could put her in rooms she could not access alone. But even as she talked, she was watching Crystal, studying her, taking note of the way Crystal navigated the highway with the ease of someone who had made this drive 100 times. The way she answered her phone briefly twice without explaining who had called. The particular quality of Crystal's confidence, which was not loud or performed, but simply there, the way the road was simply there beneath the wheels. Madison was telling herself a story in that car that she had not shared with anyone, including Destiny. She was telling herself that whatever game Crystal Lawson was running, she was going to learn it faster than Crystal expected and turn it to her own advantage. She was telling herself that she was not going to Atlanta to be mentored. She was going to be positioned. And once she understood the positioning, she would take it further than Crystal had ever taken it, because she had what Crystal had never had. The kind of beauty that changes the terms of every room it enters. The big men you are managing, she thought, looking at Crystal's profile in the afternoon light, they will be calling my line before I have been there 6 months. You brought me to your city, Crystal Lawson, but you do not know yet what you actually brought. She did not say any of this out loud. She smiled and talked about her dreams and let Crystal say, "Absolutely, and I love that energy for you, and learn how things work here first." She played the grateful, humble newcomer with the same precision she had used to craft that apology message. She was strategic, not naive. She needed Crystal to believe she was manageable. What she had not accounted for was that Crystal had been reading women like Madison for 4 years, and had already clocked every calculation happening behind Madison's warm, grateful smile before they crossed the Bibb County line. And when the Atlanta skyline appeared on the horizon and Madison pressed her hand against the passenger window like a child seeing something magnificent for the first time and whispered, "Oh my God, look at it," Crystal Lawson allowed herself one small private smile that Madison did not see, because Madison's eyes were fixed on the city ahead. The Queen had arrived. Just not the Queen Madison thought she was. Crystal's apartment was in a high-rise in Buckhead on the north side of Atlanta, where old money and new money lived side by side, and the streets were lined with restaurants that required reservations made weeks in advance and boutiques that did not display prices in their windows because their clientele did not need to see prices before deciding. The apartment itself was on the 22nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city like a stage set designed to make everyone who stood before it feel both magnificent and very small at the same time. Madison stood at those windows on her first night in Atlanta and felt magnificent. She had not yet learned to feel small. The guest room Crystal had prepared for her was nicer than any room Madison had ever slept in her life. White linen sheets so crisp they seemed almost architectural. A thick goose-down duvet that swallowed her whole when she lay down. Blackout curtains that turned the humming Atlanta night into perfect silence. A bathroom with a rainfall shower and small bottles of products lined up on the shelf that Madison recognized from Instagram and that cost more individually than her weekly grocery budget back in Macon. She stood in that shower on her first night and let the water run hot over her shoulders and told herself that this was a preview. Not the destination yet, but the universe's way of showing her what was waiting once she learned the terrain and earned her place in it. She believed that completely. With every cell in her body, she believed it. The first week was extraordinary in the way that first weeks in new cities always are for women who have been waiting their entire lives for permission to arrive somewhere that matches the size of what they feel inside. Crystal took her everywhere with the generosity of a guide who wanted her guests to be dazzled before anything else. To brunch spots in Virginia Highland where the waitstaff greeted Crystal by name and brought extra items to the table unprompted. To shopping on Peachtree where Crystal pulled things from racks with the casual authority of someone for whom price had become irrelevant. to a rooftop party in Midtown on the Thursday of that first week where Madison moved through a crowd of beautiful, well-dressed people and felt for the first time in her life like she was exactly where she had always been meant to be. She wore borrowed clothes that fit her as though they had been tailored to her specifically. A burnt sienna wrap dress that Crystal said brought out the depth in her complexion and heels that were half a size too big, but felt like walking on a runway anyway because confidence fills in for imperfect fit when it is real enough. She turned heads the moment she walked into every room and told herself that this was confirmation. The universe agreeing out loud with everything she had privately believed for years about who she was and what she deserved. Men approached her constantly. Not the boys from back home in Macon with their dusty trucks and their small-town ambitions and their eyes full of wanting and their pockets full of not nearly enough. These were different, older, more settled. Men with the easy, unhurried manner of people who had been comfortable long enough that comfort had become invisible to them the way water is invisible to fish. Men who offered to buy her drinks without making a production of it. Men who asked for her number and leaned in close and told her she was the most extraordinary woman they had seen in any room anywhere and said it in a way that felt practiced enough to be skilled but not so practiced that it felt empty. And Madison accepted all of it as her rightful due, because she had always known this was waiting for her. She had simply had to cross the distance between where she was and where she belonged to claim it. What she did not notice was that Crystal was watching every single interaction with an attention that had nothing to do with friendship or pride or the pleasure of seeing someone you care about finally step into their own. Crystal watched the way an assessor watches. The way someone watches who is building a file. She observed which men Madison responded to and at what speed. She observed how Madison handled sustained flattery, and whether it made her giddy and expansive or whether it sharpened her into something more controlled. She watched what Madison revealed about herself in casual conversation with strangers, and how freely she offered personal information to people who smiled at her warmly enough. She watched what Madison drank and how it affected her judgment and whether alcohol made the gaps in her self-awareness wider. She filed every observation away behind that polished, ever-present smile. Every vulnerability catalogued. Every gap between Madison's self-image and reality carefully noted. Every place where the confidence was performance rather than foundation marked and remembered. Crystal had a system. Madison did not know this yet. In the second week, Crystal started the lessons. She introduced them casually and without announcement, the way you introduce something you want someone to absorb before they realize they are being taught. Over coffee in the mornings before Crystal had anywhere to be. In the car between one place and another. On the balcony in the evenings when the city spread itself out below them in every direction, and the lights made everything look like a place where the rules that governed ordinary life had been suspended. In this city, Crystal said, your image is your currency, and unlike actual money, your image can devalue overnight if you are not disciplined about how you spend it. She said the men who matter in this city are not looking to chase women, they are looking to invest in them, and the difference between being chased and being invested in is a difference most women never learn to recognize until they have already spent years on the wrong side of it. She said you have to be seen with the right people in the right places before the right people will take you seriously, because credibility in Atlanta is location-based in ways that people who did not grow up here rarely understand. Madison absorbed every word with the eagerness of someone who had been waiting their entire life for exactly this classroom. She asked follow-up questions. She connected what Crystal said on Tuesday to what Crystal had said on Sunday and asked Crystal to help her understand the relationship between the two ideas. On the surface, she was the perfect student. Attentive and hungry and full of gratitude. Underneath, she was still calculating. Still watching Crystal for the seams in the performance. Still telling herself that she was learning the game, not becoming a piece in it. Because the lessons sounded like empowerment. They had the cadence and the vocabulary of one woman genuinely trying to spare another woman the mistakes she had made herself. They sounded like exactly the kind of mentorship Madison had always imagined existed somewhere in the world she was trying to enter. The kind that women with access gave to women without it. The kind that changed trajectories. What they actually were was orientation. A careful, systematic preparation of Madison's mind for the moment Crystal needed her to hear something specific and say yes to it. Every lesson was a reframing. Every piece of wisdom was laying groundwork. Every conversation that made Madison feel seen and understood and finally recognized for what she truly was worth was building toward a single conclusion that Crystal had known from the beginning. She was not teaching Madison how to succeed. She was teaching Madison how to think about herself and about value and about men and about exchange in precisely the way that would make the arrangement Crystal was constructing feel not only reasonable but like the natural and inevitable conclusion of everything Madison had always believed about herself. It was during that second week that Madison also began to notice small things she could not quite name or categorize. The way Crystal's phone lit up constantly with messages, she stepped away from the room to answer with a lowered voice. The dark car that sat outside the building some mornings that Crystal glanced at when they walked out together and then immediately looked away from with a neutrality that felt too practiced to be genuine. The man who called twice during their Thursday brunch that Crystal answered in a voice noticeably different from any voice Madison had heard her use before. Softer and more careful and arranged in a way that suggested a very specific kind of management. Madison noticed all of these things and filed them away in the back of her mind the way you file things you are not yet ready to examine directly. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself she was still carrying small-town suspicions into a city that required a more sophisticated frame of reference. She told herself that anyone who had built what Crystal had built in 4 years was going to have complexities that a newcomer could not immediately read or understand. She almost convinced herself. Then on the Friday evening of the second week, Crystal took her to dinner in Buckhead and Gerald Whitmore walked into the restaurant and sat down across from her, and something in Madison's chest went very quiet in the specific way that things go quiet right before they become very loud. Gerald was 54 years old with silver at his temples and the permanently settled authority of a man who had been powerful long enough that power had become simply the medium he existed in rather than something he needed to display. His suit was charcoal and clearly made for his body specifically, and he wore a watch that Madison recognized from Instagram posts she had seen captioned with prices that had seemed fictional when she read them. He was not warm. He was not cold either. He was the particular temperature of a man for whom other people had long since become primarily instrumental. Useful or not useful. Valuable or not valuable. Dinner lasted 2.5 hours. The restaurant had no prices on the menus, which Madison had read about as a concept and never experienced, and which gave the entire evening the quality of a place where normal rules had been suspended by mutual agreement among everyone present. Gerald asked Madison questions about herself with the focused attention of someone conducting an interview they had already determined the outcome of. He listened to her answers with a patience that felt rehearsed. He complimented her twice in ways that were specific enough to suggest genuine attention had been paid. Crystal was different at that dinner than Madison had ever seen her. Smaller somehow. More careful. She laughed at Gerald's observations a half-second before they were quite finished, as though she had been through enough of them to know exactly where they were going. She agreed with things he said that Madison privately did not agree with herself. She deferred to him about the menu and the wine and the direction of conversation with a fluency that could only come from long and deliberate practice. In the car on the way back through the Atlanta night, Madison watched Crystal's profile in the passing streetlights and felt the unease she had been calling paranoia sharpen into something more specific and more honest. She asked Crystal directly. She said, "What is Gerald really about? What is that dinner actually about?" Crystal was quiet for a moment with her eyes on the road. Then she said, "Gerald is a friend who matters. The kind of friend who changes the trajectory of a woman's life when she is smart enough to understand what is being offered and humble enough not to let her own pride stand between her and her elevation." Madison said, "I need you to say that more plainly." And Crystal turned to look at her briefly before returning her eyes to the road, and said, "The next conversation we have about Gerald is going to require you to have already decided what kind of woman you intend to be in this city. Because there are two kinds. The ones who understand the game and play it and win. And the ones who let their pride make the decision for them and end up going back to exactly the life they were so desperate to leave." She said it gently, almost with tenderness. The way you say something to someone you are completely certain will eventually come around to agreeing with you because you have been watching them closely enough to know exactly where their breaking point is. Madison said nothing for the rest of the drive. She sat with the cold thing in her chest and looked out at the city going past and thought about her mother at that stove. Thought about the specific weight of the words beauty without wisdom is a door left open in a dangerous neighborhood. Thought about every lesson Crystal had delivered over 2 weeks and what each one looked like now that she was holding them up to a different light. She was not ready to say what she was thinking yet, but she was thinking it clearly for the first time. It was also during this second week that Crystal received a phone call from her own mother back in Macon. Crystal took it in her bedroom with the door closed and Madison was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when she heard the first few words travel through the gap at the bottom of the door, and she stopped moving without meaning to and stood very still. Crystal's mother was not a quiet woman, and her voice carried even when Crystal was clearly trying to keep the conversation contained. She was saying, "Crystal Elaine Lawson, I did not raise you to go back to that town and collect that girl like she is a prize you are owed. That same girl stood in the hallway of that school and called you ugly to your face while other children watched. She told everyone your father drank. She took the most painful thing in our family and she put it in the mouths of children who did not need to know it and let them chew on it for years. Your father, my husband, a man who was fighting something he could not name, and that wicked child used his struggle as gossip. And now she sends you a message on Instagram and says sorry I was childish, and you drive back to Macon in your car to pick her up and bring her to your home." There was a pause and then Crystal's voice low and careful saying, "Mama, I know what I am doing." Her mother's voice again. "Do you? Because from where I am sitting it looks like that girl found out you were doing well and decided to use the same manipulation she used on everyone in that school. Charm when she needs something, cruelty when she does not. And you of all people should be able to see it because you watched her do it to everyone around her for 4 years." Another pause. Crystal saying something too low for Madison to hear. Then her mother's voice one final time, and this time quieter and heavier than anger. She said, "Crystal, whatever you are planning with that girl, I need you to remember who you were when you came back to me that first year in Atlanta. I need you to remember what you looked like sitting at my kitchen table after what those people did to you. I need you to remember that you told me you were never going to let anything like that happen again to you or to anyone around you. And I believed you. I still believe you. But I need to know that what you are doing right now is not revenge wearing the clothes of a business arrangement. Because revenge does not heal anything, baby. It just moves the wound somewhere else." The call ended. Madison heard the soft sound of Crystal setting her phone down. She picked up her glass of water and walked quietly back to the living room and sat down and stared at the city outside the windows and understood something she had not understood before. Crystal Lawson had not forgiven her. Not the way Crystal had described it in that Instagram message. Not the light, easy forgiveness of a woman who had moved on and left the past where it belonged. What Crystal was carrying was something older and heavier and far more complicated than forgiveness. And whatever was driving her back toward Madison was not generosity. Madison sat with that knowledge for a long time before she allowed herself to think about what it meant for her specifically. What it meant was that she was not the only person in this apartment who had arrived with a plan. And Crystal's plan had 4 years of preparation behind it while Madison's had nothing but nerve. For the first time since she had gotten in that car in Macon, Madison felt something she did not have a ready name for. It was not quite fear. It was the particular sensation of realizing you are in a game you thought you understood and discovering suddenly that the board is much larger than you could see from where you were standing. She did not say anything about what she had heard. Not that night. Not the next day. But something had shifted. And it did not shift back. It was also during those middle weeks in Atlanta that Crystal's own history with the city was written in every room Madison moved through without knowing it. Crystal had come to Atlanta at 22 from the same county in Georgia with nothing but 2 suitcases and her cousin's couch to sleep on and a hunger that was every bit as consuming as Madison's but without any of Madison's advantages. No extraordinary beauty to open doors. No easy social grace that made rooms rearrange themselves around her presence. Just the quiet, burning determination of a girl who had been overlooked and mocked and diminished for long enough that she had converted all of that pain into a single relentless forward motion. She had been used when she first arrived. By people who recognized her hunger and her inexperience and her desperate need to be seen as something other than what she had been back home. She had been brought into rooms and shown a life and told that access to it required a price that she had been too young and too desperate and too far from home to refuse clearly enough in the moment she needed to. She had been discarded when her usefulness ran out and left to figure out on her own how to rebuild from less than she had started with. That period of her life was not something she spoke about or posted about or allowed to be visible in any form on the carefully constructed surface she showed the world. It existed only in the specific and detailed knowledge she had accumulated about how the machinery of this particular world actually worked underneath its glamorous surface. And in the decision she had made sitting at her mother's kitchen table in Macon 2 years into her Atlanta life, looking like something that had been wrung out and hung to dry, while her mother pressed her hands between both of hers and did not say "I told you so," but simply said, "Come back to me, and let me help you find solid ground again." She had rebuilt. But what she built was not rescue or redemption or a success story that could be told cleanly to an admiring audience. What she built was a system of her own. A way of operating in this world that put her permanently on the side of the transaction that profited rather than the side that paid. She had decided that the world operated on exchange and that she was done being the one who gave without receiving. Done being the one who arrived with everything and left with nothing. From now on, the exchange would be conducted on her terms. She had chosen Madison 6 months before Madison ever sent that Instagram message. She had seen Madison's face in a mutual connection story and had recognized immediately, and with a clarity that required no deliberation, exactly what Madison was. The hunger was visible in every photo. The absolute unquestioned certainty about her own value. The beauty that had always been given things and therefore had never developed the instinct for caution that comes from having to work for what you need. The pride that was really just an untested assumption about how the world would continue to receive her. All of it visible from a distance. All of it exactly what was needed. And when Madison's apology message arrived in her inbox, Crystal had sat with her phone in her hand for 3 full minutes before she could steady herself enough to respond. Not from emotion. From something colder and more deliberate than emotion. She had typed "come visit sometime" and hit send and waited to see how long it would take. It had taken less than 24 hours. Back in Macon, Destiny Porter had been calling and texting since the morning Madison got in that car and left. Destiny was the kind of woman who had always been the most grounded person in any room she occupied. Practical where Madison was impulsive. Cautious where Madison was certain. She had a directness that Madison had spent 20 years finding alternately comforting and frustrating depending on whether she was in the mood to hear the truth. Destiny had been at Brenda's house the morning Crystal came to pick Madison up. She had stood on the porch and watched Crystal step out of that car, and she had been very quiet about it afterward in a way that was deeply unusual for a woman who was almost never quiet about anything. Madison had noticed the quiet but had not asked about it in the rush and excitement of leaving. She had texted Destiny from the highway that she was on her way and that everything was going to be amazing, and Destiny had responded with a single word. Careful. Madison had sent back a smiling emoji and put her phone in her bag. A week into the Atlanta trip, Destiny finally said what she had been holding, and she said it the way she had always said hard things to Madison, which was directly and without softening and with a love underneath it that was evident even when the words themselves were sharp. She called on a Wednesday night and Madison answered from the balcony of Crystal's apartment with a glass of wine in her hand, and the city spread out below her looking exactly like everything she had ever wanted. Destiny said, "I need you to actually listen to me right now and not just wait for me to finish so you can tell me why I am wrong." Madison said, "Okay. Go ahead." Destiny said, "I looked into Crystal. Not just her Instagram. I actually looked. I called my cousin Renee, who lives in East Atlanta and has been here for 8 years, and I asked her straight out what she knew about Crystal Lawson. And what Renee told me, Madison, I need you to sit down with because it is not small." Madison sat down in the balcony chair and set her wine glass on the railing and said, "What did she say?" Destiny said, "Crystal has a reputation in certain circles in Atlanta that has nothing to do with events and brand deals and the glamorous life she posts about." Renee said, "Crystal is known for bringing young women from out of town into her world. Young women who are beautiful and ambitious and hungry and who do not know anybody in the city yet. She brings them in and gets them comfortable and introduces them to wealthy older men, and she takes a cut of whatever those men provide. She said it is organized. She said it is deliberate. And she said she personally knows at least 2 women who got pulled into that arrangement, and both of them ended up far worse off than when they arrived." Madison was quiet for a moment. The city glittered below her exactly as it had every night she had stood on that balcony and looked at it. The wine glass sat on the railing catching the light. She said, "Destiny, I appreciate that you care about me. I do. But you are listening to second- and third-hand gossip from people who do not know Crystal personally and who are probably looking at her life from the outside and trying to make sense of it in the most negative way possible because what she has built is threatening to people who have not built anything." "Destiny," said Madison, "I have known you since we were 7 years old eating peanut butter sandwiches on your mama's back steps, and I am telling you right now as the person in this world who loves you most outside of your mother. That cold feeling you already have. The one you probably got the first week and have been telling yourself is just you being unsophisticated and small town. That feeling is real. It is accurate. And you need to trust it." Madison said she had to go. She said it gently, but she said it, and she ended the call and sat on the balcony for a long time after without picking up her wine again. Then she heard the glass door slide open behind her and Crystal was there leaning in the doorway with her own glass of wine looking out at the city with an expression that was perfectly relaxed and unreadable. Crystal said, "Was that your friend from home checking in on you?" Madison said yes. Crystal said, "It is genuinely hard for people who have never left a small town to understand what a bigger life actually looks like from the inside. They see it from the outside and the size of it frightens them and they call it something dangerous because calling it dangerous is easier than examining why they are not brave enough to reach for it themselves. They would rather keep you small with them than watch you become something they cannot keep up with. That is not friendship, Madison. That is fear wearing the mask of friendship." And Madison listened, and she almost believed it. But underneath the almost believing something else was sitting now. The memory of Crystal's mother's voice coming through that bedroom door. The weight of what had been said in that phone call. The look of a woman not doing a favor but settling a score that had been waiting years to be settled. She said goodnight to Crystal and went inside and lay on those white linen sheets in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought for the first time with complete honesty about where she actually was and what was actually happening around her. She would be ready in 6 more days. 3 weeks into her stay, Crystal sat Madison down in the living room on a Sunday evening, when the Atlanta sky was doing its slow golden hour performance outside the windows, and the city below looked soft and lit from within, and Crystal laid out the arrangement. Not vaguely, not wrapped in euphemism or the language of implication. Plainly and specifically, and with the complete calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation enough times that every trace of discomfort had been worn out of it long ago. Gerald Whitmore wanted to have dinner with Madison. Alone. Not a group dinner. A specific dinner at a specific restaurant followed by a specific continuation of the evening at a hotel in Midtown, where Gerald maintained a permanent suite for purposes that Crystal described without embarrassment or apology. In exchange, Gerald would provide what Crystal called a placement. A formal introduction into a social and financial ecosystem that most women spent years attempting to access and never reached. A monthly allowance, a wardrobe budget, invitations to the kind of events that were not advertised and not accessible to people who were not already known. The infrastructure of the life Madison had left Macon to build delivered fully assembled rather than having to be constructed piece by piece through years of effort and uncertainty. Crystal presented it all the way a financial advisor presents a portfolio, laying out the components, describing the expected returns. Noting the terms of the arrangement in plain language. Professional. Unhurried. As though the thing being discussed was simply a business proposition that a reasonable person would take time to consider seriously. And then she waited. Madison sat across from her on that white couch and felt the full weight of the last 3 weeks reorganize itself in her understanding all at once. Every lesson. Every dinner. Every carefully steered conversation about value and currency and the 2 kinds of women in this city. Every observation Crystal had made about what Madison wanted and feared and needed and believed about herself. All of it assembled now into the shape it had always been building toward from the moment Crystal had typed "come visit sometime" and hit send. She thought about the girl Crystal had been in that county high school. The quiet, forgettable girl who ate lunch in the library and wore the same clothes in rotation, and had a father whose struggle Madison had turned into hallway gossip for her own entertainment. She thought about Crystal's mother's voice coming through that bedroom door. She thought about what it must have cost that girl to become the woman sitting across from her now. What had been taken from her before she learned to take first? What had been done to her in this city before she built a system to make sure it could not be done again? She thought about her mother's hands wiping themselves on an apron before sitting down at a kitchen table in Macon to listen to a daughter who was not ready to hear what she needed to say. She thought about destiny saying trust it, Madison. That feeling is real. She thought about what she herself had said on Destiny's porch the morning she left. That the apology was strategic. That she had used Crystal's pain as a tool to open a door. And she thought about sitting in this apartment now on the receiving end of someone who had taken that same calculation and built an entire architecture out of it, and how that felt from the inside. It felt like looking in a mirror she had not known was there. And she felt it now with a clarity that 3 weeks of dazzle and distraction and carefully administered lessons had been designed to prevent her from feeling. The cold thing in her chest that she had been calling paranoia and unsophistication and small-town fear. It was not any of those things. It had never been any of those things. It was her mother's voice, living inside her, planted there across 26 years of kitchen tables and front porch evenings and warnings that Madison had rolled her eyes at and argued against and quietly kept anyway, the way you keep things given to you by people who love you even when you are too proud to admit you need them. She stood up. She picked up her phone from the cushion beside her. She looked at Crystal Lawson sitting across from her in that beautiful apartment 22 floors above the city that Crystal had spent 4 years learning to navigate, and she looked at her with the full clarity of someone who finally saw the whole picture and understood every element of it. And she said, I am not doing this. Crystal's expression did not change. Not a flicker. She had been here before. She had been in this exact moment with other women, and she knew the landscape of it precisely. She said, you should take some time before you decide. You do not have to answer tonight. Madison said, I have taken 3 weeks. The answer is no. Crystal said, you understand that walking out of here tonight means walking back to Macon with nothing. Everything you came here for. Everything you have been working toward your whole life. It goes with you only if you make the right decision. Madison said, I understand. And she stood up and walked to the guest room and pulled her suitcase from under the bed and began repacking everything she had unpacked 3 weeks ago with the careful, deliberate focus of someone performing an action that has a meaning beyond its practical function. She was not just packing a bag. She was reclaiming something, piece by piece, folded and placed. She called an Uber from the guest room with the door closed. She sat on the edge of the bed while she waited for it and looked around the room. The white linen. The rainfall shower visible through the open bathroom door. The blackout curtains that had given her perfect silence every night for 3 weeks. All of it beautiful. All of it designed. All of it a set. She picked up her bag and walked through the living room without looking at Crystal, who was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city with her back to the room. Madison walked to the front door and opened it and stepped into the hallway and pressed the elevator button and waited. She did not look back. In the elevator going down, she caught her own reflection in the mirrored doors. Same face, same cheekbones, same eyes. Everything her mother had called beautiful. Everything she had called her passport out of the life she did not want. Still there, still hers. But she looked at her reflection with different eyes than she had looked at herself in any mirror for the last 3 weeks, and what she saw was not a woman the city had failed to recognize. What she saw was a woman who had recognized something about herself just in time. Not just that she had nearly been used, but that she had arrived here willing to use someone too. The apology that was strategic. The gratitude that was calculated. The humble newcomer performance designed to get her close enough to take what she needed. She had come to Atlanta with her own teeth bared, and had not even recognized it as dangerous because she had been so certain her beauty would protect her from the consequences of her own choices. It had not protected her. Her mother's voice had protected her. And there was a difference between those two things that she was only now beginning to fully understand. She sat in the lobby of Crystal's building on a leather bench near the front desk until the Uber arrived, and she did not look up at the windows of the 22nd floor where Crystal Lawson was standing at the glass looking down at the city that was still entirely hers. In the car, Madison stared at her own face reflected in the dark window as Atlanta went past outside and thought about every choice that had brought her to this specific seat in this specific car at this specific hour. She thought about what she had said to her mother about being too beautiful for the life she had. She thought about how certain she had been that beauty was an asset she had not yet cashed in properly. That the right city and the right room and the right moment would convert it into everything she had always believed she deserved. She was still all of those things. She understood that now in a way she had not before. She was still beautiful. She was still ambitious. She still wanted more. None of that was wrong. None of that was the problem. The problem was that she had confused the wanting with the readiness. She had mistaken the feeling of being meant for something with the preparation that something actually required. And she had walked into a dangerous situation with sharp edges of her own that she had not yet learned to handle carefully. She had been strategic without wisdom, calculated without depth, hungry without direction. That was going to change. She was going to change it herself, on her own terms. Starting now, she was going home. What Crystal Lawson had not accounted for was that Madison Hargrove would say no at that specific moment. In 4 years of running the same play on variations of the same woman, Crystal had not encountered that particular response at that particular juncture. She had selected Madison with unusual care and confidence precisely because every piece of Madison that Crystal had assessed over 3 weeks had pointed toward yes. The hunger, the pride, the years of waiting, the absolute belief in what she deserved, the terror underneath the confidence of ending up back in Macon with nothing to show for the attempt. All of it should have produced yes. She had not accounted for Brenda Hargrove's voice being louder than all of it. What Crystal also had not counted on was Destiny Porter, who was not in Atlanta and could not be charmed or managed or reframed by Crystal's lessons because Destiny was 4 hours away in Macon and had been watching her best friend from a distance with the particular sharpness of someone who loves you enough to keep their eyes open even when you are asking them to look away. While Madison was sitting in that lobby waiting for her Uber, Destiny had already called her cousin Renee again. And Renee had already reached out to the 2 women she knew personally who had been through Crystal's arrangement. Women who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting for someone to give them a reason to say what they knew out loud. Women who had carried what had happened to them in Atlanta in the silence that shame produces and had never found a moment that felt like the right one to break it. This felt like the right one. By the time Madison was on a Greyhound bus heading south toward Macon the following morning, those women were talking to each other in a group message for the first time, comparing what had happened to each of them, finding the patterns, recognizing that what they had each experienced as an isolated personal failure was in fact a system that had been run on them deliberately by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. One of those women had a sister who was a journalist at a local Atlanta publication that covered city culture and the underbelly of Atlanta's social scene with the specific interest of a publication that understood its readers wanted the truth about the glamour they were consuming. Within 6 weeks, Crystal Lawson's name appeared in a story that the publication ran about women being recruited into exploitative arrangements under the language of mentorship and networking. The story named Gerald Whitmore. It described the system in enough specific detail that anyone who read it and had been through it would recognize exactly what was being described. Gerald hired an attorney immediately, a very good attorney, the kind that expensive problems require. Crystal had no attorney that good because Crystal had always operated on the assumption that the women she brought through her arrangement would never speak because shame is a reliable silencer. She had been right about that until she was not. The infrastructure she had spent 4 years assembling began to come apart from the edges. The way expensive things do when the foundation was built on something that could not bear sustained weight. The rooftop parties stopped being posted. The designer bags disappeared from her feed. The 80,000 followers who had watched her life like a highlight reel began to notice the silence and then to talk about the silence in the comments. Madison Hargrove heard about all of it from Destiny, who heard it from Renee. She was in Macon when it happened. She was sitting at her mother's kitchen table eating grits that tasted better than she had remembered them tasting and listening to Brenda hum that low, slow song at the stove and feeling something she had not expected to feel sitting in that kitchen that she had spent years being desperate to leave. Gratitude. Gratitude for the voice inside her that had spoken clearly when it needed to. For the years of kitchen table warnings and front porch wisdom that she had absorbed without meaning to while she was busy rolling her eyes at it. For a mother who had planted something in her daughter that no city and no system and no carefully constructed lesson about the two kinds of women could reach or remove or replace. She was still in Macon. She was still 26. She still wanted more than the life she currently had. That had not changed, and it was not going to change because wanting more was not the problem. It had never been the problem. The difference now was that she understood something she had not understood when she packed those bags and stood at her mother's kitchen door. That wanting something and being ready for it are two entirely different countries separated by real distance that has to be traveled honestly. That the preparation is not the obstacle between you and the life you want. The preparation is the road. She was going to take that road. On her own terms. In her own time. But she also knew now that she carried her own work to do. Not just the work of building a career or a platform or a life larger than Macon. The inner work. The work of understanding why she had walked into Crystal's world with calculations of her own and no wisdom to govern them. The work of looking honestly at the girl who had spread rumors about Crystal's father in that high school hallway and asking herself what that girl had been afraid of and why cruelty had felt safer than compassion. That work was not comfortable. But it was hers, and she was not going to look away from it. She was not going to become Crystal Lawson. She understood now exactly how Crystal had become Crystal Lawson. And she understood that the road to that version of yourself began with much smaller choices than anyone ever recognized at the time. She was going to make different choices, starting with honest ones. Brenda Hargrove heard the knock at the door on a Saturday morning 3 days after Madison left Atlanta and opened it to find her daughter standing on the porch in the early Georgia morning light with a small bag at her feet and eyes that had seen something they could not unsee. Not broken eyes. Not defeated eyes. Something more complicated and more valuable than either of those things. Eyes that had looked at the truth of something difficult and stayed open. Brenda did not say, "I told you so." She did not ask what happened or demand an accounting of 3 weeks or let the worry of the last several days come out as anything other than what it actually was. She opened the door wider and stepped back and said, "Come inside, baby, and let me fix you a plate." And Madison Hargrove picked up her bag and walked back into the kitchen with the cracked linoleum and the dripping window unit and the smell of grease and dish soap and the particular quality of light that came through that small window every morning, and for the first time in a very long time it felt like exactly what it was. Not a prison. Not a failure. Not evidence of everything she had not yet become. Home. The place that holds you. The place that waits. The place you come back to not because the story is over but because you need solid ground under your feet before the next part of the story can begin. Brenda stood at the stove and stirred and hummed and did not say one single word about being right. Because being right had never been the point. It had never been what any of the warnings and the proverbs and the kitchen table conversations had been about. They had been about this. Her daughter walking back through that door. Whole. Still herself. Still wanting. Still capable of becoming everything she had always believed she was meant to be. Just with her eyes open now. For the first 2 weeks back, Madison barely left the house. She sat on the back steps where she and Destiny had eaten peanut butter sandwiches as children, and she let herself feel everything she had been moving too fast to feel in Atlanta. The embarrassment of how close she had come to a decision she could not have undone. The shame of recognizing her own calculation in Crystal's calculation. The grief of understanding that the confident certainty she had carried her whole life had not been strength all along. It had been an untested assumption. And now it had been tested. She did not perform a recovery. She did not post anything. She did not tell a curated version of the story to make herself look wiser in retrospect than she had actually been. She sat with all of it on those back steps, and she let Destiny come and sit beside her without saying much, and she let Brenda feed her and hum at the stove, and she let the ordinary quiet of Macon, Georgia do what cities do not know how to do, which is wait for you without wanting anything from you. At the end of those 2 weeks, she got up. 3 months after coming home, Madison enrolled in a digital marketing program at a college in Macon. She started a social media account that had nothing in common with Crystal Lawson's carefully constructed Instagram architecture. It was not glamorous. It was not polished. It documented small-town Georgia life with the warmth and specificity and honesty of someone who had gone looking for something elsewhere and come back understanding that the place you are from has its own value if you know how to see it and how to show it to other people. It was real. It was hers. It required nothing from her that she was not willing to give. By the end of the year, she had 12,000 followers. People who did not know her mother or her hometown or anything about where she had come from. Strangers who knew her name. Not because of anyone else's arrangement or anyone else's doors or anyone else's system designed to profit from her hunger. Because of her own work, her own voice, her own particular way of seeing things and telling the truth about them. It was a beginning, a real one, built on ground she had tested and found solid. It was enough. There is a version of Madison Hargrove's story that ends very differently. In that version, she does not say no in that living room on that Sunday evening. In that version, the hunger wins over the wisdom, and the city takes what it always takes from women who arrive in it unprepared and beautiful and certain and leaves behind something smaller and harder and not quite whole. That version happens every single day to women just like Madison. Women who are beautiful and ambitious and hungry for the life they know in their bones they deserve. Women who cross paths with someone who has learned to recognize that hunger from a distance and use it as a tool. Women who mistake the first person who tells them they are worth more than where they come from for someone who actually wants them to get there. But there is something else in this story that is important to say. Because Madison was not just a victim. She arrived in Atlanta with her own calculations, her own agenda, her own willingness to use another person's pain as a stepping stone. She was not innocent. She was young and untested and far more dangerous to herself than she knew. And the grace that saved her was not just her mother's wisdom. It was also the moment on that white couch when she looked at Crystal Lawson and recognized herself in what she was looking at and chose not to become it. That choice is available to all of us. But it requires us to be honest about what we are bringing into the rooms we walk into. Not just what we want, but what we are willing to do to get it. And whether we can live with the version of ourselves we would have to become. The difference between the two versions of this story was not Madison's beauty. It was not her confidence or her ambition or even her courage in the moment she needed it. It was her mother's voice, living inside her, planted there across 26 years of breakfast tables and front porch evenings and warnings received with eye rolls and quietly kept anyway the way daughters keep things given to them by mothers, even when they are too proud in the moment to admit they need them. If you are a mother watching this today, if you have a daughter somewhere who is beautiful and hungry and absolutely certain she is meant for more than the life she currently has, keep talking, keep showing up, keep saying the things they groan at and argue with and walk away from in the middle of. Keep planting. Because one night in a beautiful apartment in a city that does not care how beautiful they are or where they came from or how long they waited, your voice will be the loudest thing in the room. And that will be enough to bring them home. If the story moved something in you, press the subscribe button, like and share this video with someone else. It could be a loved one in need of it, you might never know. This has been Fireside Tales. We'll see you at the next fire.